The moment someone celebrates taking your home before the paperwork is finished is usually the moment they stop paying attention to who they're really dealing with. The first thing I heard that morning wasn't birdsong drifting across my fields. It was the slow metallic clank of a heavy chain being dragged across my gravel driveway, followed by the low idle of a tow truck and the crisp snap of someone unfolding a temporary barricade. By the time I stepped onto my front porch with a mug of black coffee warming my hands, 3 HOA board members were already standing beside my mailbox as if they owned the place. Fresh rain had darkened the old oak fence, the scent of damp soil mixed with diesel exhaust, and beyond them sat 2 sheriff's deputies watching quietly from their cruisers. They weren't pointing fingers. They weren't shouting. They were simply waiting for paperwork. Margaret Caldwell stood at the center of it all in a perfectly pressed cream blazer that somehow looked untouched by the muddy ground beneath her expensive heels. She smiled the way some people smile when they believe the ending has already been written. "Mr. Whitmore," she called, lifting a thick folder high enough for everyone to see. "Today your farmhouse officially becomes HOA property." Several neighbors had gathered near the entrance road, whispering behind their phones as they recorded every second. Someone had already started live streaming. I could hear notification chimes floating across the quiet morning every few seconds. Margaret loved an audience. She always had. She glanced toward the deputies, then back at me, almost disappointed that I wasn't angry. "You should probably start packing," she added. "This won't take long." I took one slow sip of coffee instead. The bitter warmth lingered on my tongue while I looked across the pasture my grandfather had fenced by hand more than 60 years earlier. Every fence post, every weathered barn beam, every acre carried a story that couldn't fit inside a legal filing cabinet. I had spent my entire life protecting this land. I wasn't about to lose it because someone in a blazer thought confidence was the same thing as ownership. The deputies exchanged quick looks when they noticed I hadn't moved an inch. One of them checked his watch. The tow truck driver leaned against his door, waiting for instructions that hadn't come yet. Margaret mistook my silence for surrender. She walked closer, holding the folder just inches from my face. "Final opportunity," she said. "Sign voluntarily, and we'll make this easy." I looked at the signature page, but never reached for the pen. Instead, I asked one simple question. "Is that every document you're relying on today?" She nodded without hesitation. "Every single one." "Good," I answered quietly. I'd hate for anyone to realize later they forgot something important. She laughed. The board members laughed with her. Even a few people filming across the road chuckled as though I'd just admitted defeat. None of them noticed me glance toward the county road where a black sedan had just appeared over the hill, moving steadily through the morning fog without rushing. I checked my watch one more time, finished the last sip of coffee, and set the empty mug on the porch railing. Margaret believed she had arrived to seize my farmhouse. She had no idea the people inside that approaching car weren't coming to save my property. They were coming because someone had finally informed them that the neighborhood trying to remove me was financed by an institution whose controlling owner had been standing on this porch the entire time. Nobody watching that driveway could have guessed that I had spent most of my life making sure people kept their homes instead of losing them. As the black sedan rolled closer, I found myself thinking back to the road that had brought me here. My name is Nathan Whitmore. I am 43 years old, and I am exactly the kind of man people underestimate. That has never bothered me. In fact, it has served me better than any expensive suit or impressive title ever could. I was born in the same white farmhouse standing behind me, delivered in the upstairs bedroom before the county hospital was even 20 minutes away by paved road. My grandfather cleared these fields with equipment that would belong in a museum today. My father expanded the cattle operation one fence line at a time. By the time I inherited the property, every inch of these 120 acres carried fingerprints from 3 generations of my family. The weathered barns still smelled of fresh-cut pine after summer repairs. Diesel fuel lingered inside the equipment shed, and every sunrise painted the hayfields the same deep gold I remembered from childhood. While most people assumed I never left this county, the truth was a little different. I earned a finance degree, spent years working inside commercial lending, and eventually invested in businesses that most of my neighbors had never heard of. I never chased headlines. I never put my name on office buildings. Quiet investments have a way of growing when nobody is paying attention. Eventually, those investments led me into community banking, then regional lending, and finally a holding company that specialized in residential mortgages across several states. I remained on the farm because this was home, not because I lacked other options. Every Monday morning, I could inspect a pasture before breakfast and still attend board meetings through a secure video call before 9 o'clock. Most people who drove past my mailbox only noticed an old pickup truck with faded paint, worn work boots drying on the porch, and a man repairing fences instead of wearing cufflinks. Margaret certainly noticed those things. She never noticed the laptop sitting inside my office overlooking the south pasture, the one connected to financial reports worth billions of dollars in residential loans. She never asked why delivery drivers occasionally arrived with confidential overnight envelopes instead of farm supplies. She assumed dirt under my fingernails meant I had never signed a corporate document in my life. I never corrected her because there was no reason to. Real authority does not need introductions. It simply waits until facts matter more than appearances. That lesson came from my father. He used to tell me that the loudest tractor in the county was rarely the one pulling the heaviest load. Standing on that porch, hearing neighbors whisper while phones continued recording, I realized Margaret had built her entire strategy on appearances. She believed she was confronting an isolated farmer with no influence beyond his fence line. She never imagined that the same neighborhood she claimed to protect had quietly financed nearly every home through an institution connected to decisions I helped oversee. The irony was almost unbelievable. She had spent months trying to force one homeowner out without ever asking who made it possible for so many families to move into that subdivision in the first place. Margaret Caldwell had not become president of Willow Creek Estates because she enjoyed volunteer work. She treated the position like the corner office of a corporation, complete with carefully staged board meetings, color-coded binders, and the confidence of someone who believed rules only applied to other people. Long before she focused on my farmhouse, she had built a reputation throughout the subdivision. She measured lawns with a tape measure, photographed mailboxes from the street, and sent violation notices over flower pots that were supposedly the wrong shade of blue. Every conversation somehow ended with the same sentence. Community standards protect property values. The phrase sounded polished, but after hearing it enough times, it felt less like guidance and more like a warning. Her closest allies on the board never questioned her decisions. They nodded during meetings, approved every recommendation, and congratulated themselves for keeping the neighborhood exclusive. They drove expensive sport utility vehicles, attended every social gathering at the clubhouse, and acted as though the entrance gates separated them from the rest of the world. To them, my farmhouse was an inconvenience sitting beside their carefully planned subdivision. They did not see history. They saw undeveloped acreage that interrupted their expansion plans. It started with friendly suggestions. Margaret offered to buy a strip of my land for what she called a fair community price. I declined without hesitation. A month later, the survey requests began arriving. Then came letters questioning my fence line, my drainage ditch, my equipment shed, and even the gravel entrance that had existed decades before the subdivision was ever built. County inspectors visited more often than they ever had before, finding nothing that violated any ordinance. That only seemed to frustrate Margaret even more. She stopped pretending the disagreement was about landscaping. During one board meeting, she openly described my property as the final obstacle preventing the neighborhood from reaching its full potential. Several residents applauded. Others looked uncomfortable but stayed silent. Silence, I learned, was often the strongest ally of people who abused small amounts of authority. Over the following months, the notices multiplied. Every envelope arrived by certified mail. Every accusation referenced another section of the bylaws, even though my farmhouse was governed by entirely different property agreements. I answered each letter politely. I kept every envelope. I scanned every page. I saved every electronic message in carefully organized folders. Margaret interpreted my calm responses as weakness. She had no idea I documented paperwork the same way my grandfather documented crop yields, believing that careful records always mattered sooner or later. One afternoon, she stood at my front gate wearing sunglasses despite the cloudy sky and smiled as though she was offering a generous compromise. "You are standing in the way of progress, Nathan," she said. "Eventually, everyone realizes they cannot fight the board forever." I simply thanked her for stopping by and asked whether she could send her proposal by electronic mail instead. She looked puzzled for a second before agreeing. That tiny request seemed insignificant to her. To me, it meant another written record with dates, names, and exact wording. Every conversation followed the same pattern after that. I never argued. I never raised my voice. I only asked for documents, confirmations, and copies. Margaret believed she was building a legal case against me. In reality, she was carefully assembling a complete history of her own decisions, one signed document at a time. After months of collecting signatures, photographs, and carefully worded complaints, Margaret decided paperwork alone was not enough. She wanted a public victory. That was when everything accelerated. The certified letters began arriving almost every week, each one thicker than the last. One claimed my equipment shed violated architectural standards that had never applied to agricultural property. Another insisted my gravel entrance created unnecessary dust for subdivision residents, even though the road had existed decades before the first house was built. Then came accusations that my split-rail fence created a visual inconsistency with the surrounding neighborhood. I almost smiled reading that one because the fence was older than every member of the board combined. Every letter demanded a response within impossible deadlines. Every notice carried language designed to intimidate rather than inform. I answered every one before the deadline, attached supporting documents, and requested written confirmation that my response had been received. I never ignored a single communication. That seemed to frustrate Margaret more than any argument ever could. She wanted emotion. She received documentation. One afternoon I received notice that the board had voted to begin legal action seeking control of the farmhouse through what they described as emergency community enforcement. The phrase sounded dramatic, but the supporting documents contained assumptions instead of facts. Their attorney requested access to portions of my property for inspection. I agreed, provided the request came through proper legal channels and every visit was scheduled in writing. They accepted. Cameras recorded each visit. Dates, times, names, and conversations were carefully logged. Even the weather became part of my records. If rain delayed an inspection by 30 minutes, it was written down. If someone arrived early, that was documented as well. My grandfather used to say memory fades, but ink does not. Those words echoed every evening as I organized another folder inside my office. Margaret mistook organization for fear. During one community meeting, she proudly announced that my refusal to cooperate had forced the board to take stronger action. I was sitting quietly in the back of the room. She never acknowledged that every request she claimed I ignored had actually been answered within 24 hours. She simply expected nobody to compare her statements with the written record. Then the board hired a property management company to prepare what they called the transition process. Hearing those words made several neighbors believe the farmhouse had already been lost. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some people stopped waving when they drove past. Others looked embarrassed because they genuinely believed I had done something wrong. I blame none of them. Most people trust official-looking documents without asking who prepared them. Meanwhile, I continued feeding cattle every morning before sunrise, repairing fences after afternoon storms, and reviewing financial reports once the farm work was finished. Life remained surprisingly ordinary despite the growing stack of legal correspondence on my desk. Then Margaret scheduled the final enforcement date. Tow trucks were reserved. Temporary fencing was ordered. Deputies were notified to keep the peace while civil paperwork was served. She even arranged for local media to receive advance notice because she wanted photographs of the board protecting community standards. Every detail had been planned with remarkable confidence. What she never realized was that every new document, every scheduled meeting, every electronic message, and every public announcement expanded a timeline that would eventually tell a much larger story than the one she intended. She believed she was constructing an airtight case against one farmer. In reality, she was leaving behind a complete record of every decision that others would soon examine with far greater authority than any homeowners association could ever claim. By the time the enforcement date arrived, I already knew exactly how the morning would unfold because Margaret had unknowingly explained the entire plan herself through weeks of electronic mail, meeting minutes, certified letters, and public announcements. She believed transparency proved confidence. I believed documentation preserved truth. Standing on my porch with the empty coffee mug beside me, I watched every vehicle arrive almost exactly according to the schedule she had distributed. The tow truck backed into position. The temporary barricades were unloaded. The board members straightened their jackets while neighbors gathered farther down the road. Cell phones pointed toward the farmhouse like cameras waiting for the final scene of a movie. Margaret walked across my driveway carrying another polished binder beneath her arm. She smiled as though she had already won in court, although no judge had ever ruled that my family no longer owned this land. She stopped a few feet away and held out another packet of papers. "Nathan, this is your final opportunity to cooperate voluntarily," she said. I accepted the envelope without opening it. Instead, I asked, "Is this the complete file?" She looked almost amused. "Yes, every relevant document is included." I nodded slowly. "Would you mind confirming that in writing before everyone leaves today?" She laughed and turned toward the people recording with their phones. "He is still asking for paperwork." Several board members joined her laughter. One even shook his head as though I had completely lost touch with reality. None of them understood why I kept asking the same question. Every confirmation mattered. Every statement established a timeline. Every signature connected another piece of the story. One deputy approached respectfully and explained that they were present only to maintain order during the civil process. I thanked him for clarifying that point. Then I asked whether his arrival time had been entered into the official incident log. He checked his watch, wrote something on his clipboard, and answered yes. Margaret rolled her eyes dramatically. "Always another question," she muttered. She thought I was delaying the inevitable. In truth, I wanted every public official to create an accurate record of the morning exactly as it happened. A local reporter stepped closer and asked if I wished to make a statement before the process continued. I smiled politely and answered, "Only one. Please make sure every document discussed today becomes part of the public record." The reporter scribbled those words into a notebook. Margaret looked pleased. She interpreted my calm voice as resignation. She had spent months expecting anger, threats, or emotional outbursts. Instead, she received courtesy, patience, and requests for written confirmation. That confused her more than resistance ever could. Then something small caught my attention. One of the younger attorneys representing the association glanced down at a folder, paused for a second, and looked back at my name printed across the property file. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. He studied me again, then quietly stepped away from the group to make a telephone call. Margaret remained busy speaking with reporters and never noticed him. I noticed because I have spent years inside boardrooms where fortunes often changed with nothing more than a silent glance across a conference table. The black sedan I had seen approaching earlier finally turned into the long gravel driveway, its tires crunching softly over the stones my grandfather had spread decades ago. It parked without urgency. No lights, no dramatic entrance, just quiet confidence. I recognized the people stepping out before anyone else did. And for the first time that morning, I realized the careful record Margaret had been creating for months was finally about to reach the people who understood exactly what every single page actually meant. The moment the passengers stepped out of the black sedan, the atmosphere changed in a way that was almost impossible to explain. There were no raised voices, no dramatic gestures, and no rush toward anyone standing in my driveway. They simply walked with the quiet confidence of people who already understood why they had been invited. The older gentleman in front carried nothing more than a slim leather portfolio. Behind him came a woman in a navy business suit and another attorney pulling a small rolling case. Margaret glanced at them with polite curiosity before turning back toward the reporter beside her. She clearly assumed they were my last-minute legal representatives trying to delay the inevitable. She could not have been more mistaken. The lead attorney stopped a few feet from me, smiled, and extended his hand. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," he said. "Thank you for asking us to witness today's proceedings." I shook his hand. "I appreciate everyone making the trip." Margaret folded her arms. "And you are?" she asked with a confident smile. The attorney handed her a business card. I watched her expression remain relaxed for exactly 3 seconds before the color in her face faded. Her eyes moved from the card to me, then back to the card again. The logo belonged to Hawthorne Financial Holdings, the parent company that controlled Hawthorne Community Mortgage Bank. She looked confused rather than frightened, which told me she still did not understand the connection. "We are here," the attorney explained calmly, Because this property owner requested that today's events be independently documented due to potential implications involving properties financed within this development. One of the younger board members frowned. What does our neighborhood financing have to do with this farm? The attorney answered without hesitation. Potentially quite a lot. Margaret tried to recover immediately. Our association has nothing to discuss with your bank. The attorney remained perfectly courteous. Perhaps not. However, the holding company does have an interest whenever questions arise regarding actions that could affect collateral, governance, disclosure obligations, or material risk involving communities financed through affiliated lending institutions. Several people standing nearby stopped recording long enough to exchange puzzled looks. The younger association attorney quietly stepped closer to Margaret and whispered something into her ear. She shook her head, clearly refusing to believe whatever he had just discovered. Finally, she looked directly at me. What exactly is going on? She demanded. For the first time that morning, I answered a question with something more than another request for documentation. You spent months assuming I was simply the farmer living next door, I said. You never once asked why people from a regional financial holding company would know my name before arriving here. The lead attorney opened the leather portfolio and removed several corporate documents. For the record, he said clearly enough. For everyone present to hear, Mr. Nathan Whitmore is the controlling shareholder of Hawthorne Financial Holdings, which maintains ownership interests in Hawthorne Community Mortgage Bank. According to publicly filed corporate records, that institution services a substantial portion of the residential mortgages within this subdivision. Complete silence settled over the driveway. Even the diesel engine of the tow truck suddenly seemed louder than before. Nobody moved. Nobody laughed anymore. Margaret slowly lowered the folder she had been holding all morning. The confidence that had carried her through months of meetings disappeared without anyone raising a voice. The only thing that had changed was that everyone finally understood who had been quietly standing on that front porch from the very beginning. No one ordered the tow truck to leave. No one demanded that the deputies arrest anyone. Nothing dramatic happened because real authority rarely announces itself with shouting. Instead, the lead attorney calmly asked whether everyone would mind pausing the enforcement process until several procedural questions could be answered. The deputies agreed immediately because the matter had clearly become more complicated than the original civil paperwork suggested. Margaret tried to regain control of the conversation by insisting that the association had followed every required step. The attorney nodded respectfully. That may very well be, he replied. Our responsibility is not to determine ownership of this farmhouse today. Our responsibility is to determine whether actions taken during this process require additional review under lending agreements, corporate governance policies, and regulatory reporting obligations. Those words landed far differently than any threat ever could. Several board members looked at one another with growing uncertainty. One quietly asked what regulatory reporting meant. The attorney answered with complete professionalism. When information suggests that actions involving collateral, property rights, disclosures, or community governance could affect financed assets, institutions sometimes have a duty to review the underlying documentation. Reviews are standard business practice. They protect homeowners, lenders, investors, and everyone involved. Margaret interrupted before he could continue. You cannot interfere with our association. I finally spoke again. Nobody is interfering with your association, Margaret. You have every right to make decisions within your authority. The question is whether every decision was made using accurate information and proper procedures. That is something independent reviewers can determine. The younger attorney representing the association slowly closed his binder. He no longer looked confident. Instead, he quietly asked whether copies of the board minutes, electronic correspondence, architectural review records, and enforcement notices had been preserved. Margaret answered proudly that everything had been documented. I almost smiled because that was exactly what I had hoped to hear. Every certified letter she had mailed, every electronic message she had sent, every meeting agenda, every signed resolution, every public statement. She believed those records proved the association had acted decisively. I believe they told a complete chronological story that others would now evaluate page by page. The representative from Hawthorne Financial Holdings opened the rolling case and removed several sealed envelopes. One was addressed to the association's legal counsel. Another was prepared for the property management company. A third contained formal preservation requests asking that all relevant records remain unchanged while routine reviews were conducted. Nobody accused anyone of wrongdoing. Nobody declared anyone guilty. The documents simply ensured that nothing important would disappear before qualified professionals had the opportunity to examine it. Even the reporter standing near the driveway seemed surprised by how ordinary the process actually looked. There were no dramatic speeches. There was only paperwork, signatures acknowledging receipt, and polite conversations about deadlines. The tow truck driver quietly climbed back into his cab after being informed that no immediate action would be taken. The deputies noted the change in status on their incident log before returning to their vehicles. Margaret remained standing in the driveway holding the same binder she had carried so confidently that morning. For the first time since this conflict began, she was no longer directing the process. The process was now directing itself, guided by documents, contracts, and procedures that had existed long before either of us ever attended a single homeowners association meeting. The weeks that followed moved much more quietly than the morning everyone remembered, yet they changed far more than a single day ever could. Independent reviewers requested board minutes, financial records, enforcement logs, electronic correspondence, architectural committee reports, and communications with outside contractors. Because Margaret had insisted on documenting everything, there was no shortage of material to examine. Every file was organized exactly as she had proudly described. Every vote had a date. Every notice carried a signature. Every electronic message included timestamps. Ironically, the detailed record she believed would justify every decision became the roadmap investigators used to understand how those decisions had been made. The review was not about punishing anyone. It was about determining whether proper governance procedures had been followed and whether representations made to homeowners, lenders, and third parties accurately reflected the facts. Several residents who had quietly accepted violation notices over the years suddenly realized they still possessed old letters, photographs, and electronic messages of their own. They began comparing dates. They compared meeting announcements with official minutes. They compared public statements with internal correspondence. The picture that emerged was far more complicated than anyone had expected. Questions appeared that had never been asked before. Why had similar properties received completely different treatment? Why had certain enforcement actions been accelerated while others had quietly disappeared? Why had some board discussions never been reflected in the official summaries distributed to residents? Those questions did not come from me. They came from homeowners who finally understood the importance of the records they had saved for years. Attendance at the next association meeting reached a level nobody could remember. Instead of discussing flower beds and mailbox colors, residents asked about transparency, record retention, legal authority, and decision-making. Several board members who had once voted with little discussion admitted they had relied almost entirely on Margaret's recommendations without independently reviewing supporting information. The property management company announced it would cooperate fully with every request for documentation. The association's attorney recommended that outside governance specialists complete an independent review before any additional enforcement actions moved forward. Even local reporters who had expected a simple neighborhood dispute found themselves covering a story about accountability instead. One article summarized it perfectly. Sometimes the most important question is not whether someone had authority, but whether that authority was exercised responsibly. Margaret attended those meetings, but she no longer controlled the conversation. She answered questions when asked, listened to concerns she had once dismissed, and watched as residents requested leadership changes through procedures already outlined in the governing documents. The same rulebook she had often quoted now guided the community through an orderly transition. No dramatic confrontation was necessary. No one celebrated another person's embarrassment. The neighborhood simply began rebuilding trust one meeting at a time. As for the farmhouse, it remained exactly where it had always been. The old porch still overlooked the pasture. The fence still followed the same property line my grandfather had walked decades earlier. Every evening the wind carried the familiar scent of fresh hay across the fields, reminding me that while people sometimes mistake confidence for power, genuine stability comes from foundations built carefully over time. In the end, it was not influence, wealth, or titles that changed everything. It was the simple fact that accurate records, patient decisions, and honest Procedures have a remarkable way of revealing the truth when everyone is finally willing to read the entire story. Several months later, life on the farm looked remarkably similar to the way it had before any of this began, and I think that is what made the ending feel so satisfying. The sunrise still reached the front porch before 6:30 during the summer. The cattle still wandered toward the north pasture every morning. The old windmill still turned slowly whenever a steady breeze crossed the fields. The smell of fresh hay, damp earth, and brewed coffee filled the air exactly as it had when my grandfather owned this land. The farmhouse never needed to become a monument to victory because it had always been exactly what it was meant to be, a family home built to outlast temporary conflicts. The neighborhood beside my property also settled into a quieter rhythm. A newly elected board focused less on finding violations and more on answering questions. Meeting agendas became easier to understand. Financial reports were shared openly with residents. Homeowners who had once felt ignored discovered that respectful conversations accomplished far more than intimidating letters ever had. The greatest surprise was that many neighbors who had barely spoken to me before began stopping by the farm simply to introduce themselves. Some apologized for believing rumors. Others admitted they had remained silent because they assumed challenging authority would only make their own lives more difficult. I never blamed them. Fear often grows wherever transparency disappears. One Saturday morning, while repairing an old fence post near the road, I noticed a familiar vehicle slow down before turning into the driveway. Margaret stepped out alone. She looked very different from the woman who had stood on this same gravel months earlier, holding a thick binder and speaking with absolute certainty. There was no audience this time, no reporters, and no board members standing behind her. She simply thanked me for agreeing to speak with her for a few minutes. Our conversation remained private, and that is exactly where it belongs. Some things do not need to become public to matter. When she left, she quietly looked back at the farmhouse one last time before driving away. I returned to repairing the fence because some days the most important work is the ordinary work waiting in front of you. Every so often people still ask why I never used my position to threaten anyone the moment the conflict began. The answer has always been simple. Real authority is not about making people feel small. It is about protecting systems that remain fair even when emotions run high. If I had used influence to frighten people into backing down, I would have become exactly the kind of person I believed I was standing against. Instead, I trusted contracts, records, procedures, and patient truth. Those things move more slowly than anger, but they usually travel much farther. As the sun disappeared behind the western tree line that evening, I sat on the same porch where everything had seemed so uncertain months before. The empty coffee mug rested on the railing. The field stretched peacefully toward the horizon, and the only sound was the gentle chorus of crickets beginning another quiet night. Looking across the land my family had cared for across 3 generations, I realized the greatest victory was never proving who held more power. The greatest victory was proving that integrity does not need to raise its voice. Justice is rarely loud. It is patient enough to wait for the truth, wise enough to respect the rules, and strong enough to let the facts speak for themselves when the time finally comes.